It's interesting that the first sin to enter our world was that of pride. It was pride that was the snare that seduced humanity to turn from God, and so to turn inwards on ourselves and to seek a world, to seek a life without God. All of the saints acknowledge that pride is one of the most deadly of all the sins. The likes of St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Gregory the Great, for example, go so far as describing pride as the queen of all the vices. And it's easy to see why and how this is the case. When pride reigns supreme in our hearts, not only does it turn us away from God, in other words, a separation takes place, a gulf has been created between us and God, but more significantly, that divine whole within us still remains. And that divine whole, if you like to call it as such, still needs to be filled with something else. And that something else is not of God. And so that is what becomes the inordinate love for oneself, our own sense of superiority and importance, an inflated love for ourselves and our own talents above everybody else. Someone described pride as the place of self-absorption, and I think that's quite a striking description of it, don't you? And where pride is dangerous, why it deserves the title of the queen of the vices, is that so often we don't recognize it until it's too late. Let's look again then at that first reading. Really, we become a sort of a fly on the wall during that scene in which the godless speak to one another. We can see how pride, the queen of all the vices, makes a demand, even making a demand on our neighbours, dragging them down, looking for their demise and their destruction. Indeed, it has to drag our neighbour down in order for us to maintain our own sense of superiority. Because let's be honest now, I'm better than the rest of you. So self-absorbed, the godless look only for the virtuous man's condemnation, looking to catch him out, rather than his encouragement, his well-being, and looking for ultimately his flourishing. I'm sure that at different times and in different levels in our life, all of us can relate to this. Perhaps as we reflect back at key moments of our lives, we recognize, perhaps within ourselves, how the ugliness of pride has dominated and taken over. And all of this happens all too easily, doesn't it? Particularly when our secular world, devoid of God, places pride on that pedestal as one of the most important of the virtues. And the infection of poison inflicted by pride only gets worse and worse because we cannot confess it, because we just don't see it within ourselves. And what's more, it leads ultimately to other vices, to other moments of sin. We only have to look at how that second reading beautifully plays itself out from the start to see how that happens. And so when a penitent is able to confess such a vice as pride, this is such a huge moment of liberation and a cause for immense joy. Such a confession comes from the depths of one's own examination of conscience, that safe space in which we seek to see ourselves as we really are, to see ourselves as God sees us. One of my favorite saints of all time, Saint Teresa of Avila, describes this moment as a growth in self-knowledge, or self-awareness, we could say. She reflects that this is absolutely necessary and indispensable for our growth in the spiritual life. This is what she said to the sisters. These are her words now. She says, "Mark well, however, that self-knowledge is indispensable, even for those whom God takes to dwell in the same mansion with himself." And it is this grace of self-knowledge which becomes the first step of being able to challenge that poison of pride within us. Why? Because self-knowledge, real self-knowledge, has no place for superiority or that self-absorption of our own importance. Our self-knowledge is able to gift us with the gift of humility. And it's this humility which becomes pride's antidote, the prescription. And it's this grace of humility through which we are once again able to penetrate the depths and to once again catch a glimpse of the divine physician. Let's go back to Teresa of Avila again. This is what she says. "I believe that we shall never learn how to know ourselves except by endeavoring to know God. For beholding his greatness, we are struck by our own baseness. His purity shows our foulness, and by meditating on his humility, we find how very far we are from being humble." Doesn't this present us with a beautiful starting point along our road in the spiritual life and our road of discipleship? If we are able to relate to the godless men, perhaps, in that first reading, let this be a moment of grace, of conversion, of us being able, that metanoia moment of turning back to the Lord. And that image of the little child in the gospel, in which Jesus presents to us and shows into the foreground, can really help us here, so that we may be able to see things anew, to see things through that pure and innocent eyes of that child. Amen.